She stood quietly in the corner, her hands trembling as her parents raised their voices. They looked at her not with love, but with shame. To them, she had failed. A simple woman with no fancy degrees, no big job title, and no shining future as far as they could see. "You'll never be anything," her mother had said sharply. "You marry beneath our expectations," her father added, shaking his head in disappointment. They didn't care that she had always been kind, loyal, and humble. In their eyes, none of that mattered. What mattered was status, reputation, and wealth. And she had none of those. What her parents didn't know, though, was that the man she married, the quiet one they dismissed so easily, wasn't just some nobody. He was a billionaire. Not the flashy type who boasted about money, but the kind who stayed in the shadows, building an empire from the ground up without ever needing to show off. He loved her not for her looks or her background, but for her heart. He saw the strength in her that her own family ignored. The room was tense. Her parents went on, cutting her down with words, certain they were right. She stood there, eyes welling up but refusing to cry. And then the front door opened. Footsteps echoed through the hallway. He walked in, calm, confident, and completely unbothered by their judgment. Her parents turned around, and their expressions changed in an instant. They had no idea who he really was, until now. But what he said next silenced the room and shifted everything. You won't believe how this moment turned their world upside down. Stay tuned. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. Just his presence seemed to shift the air in the room. Her parents stood frozen, unsure whether to speak or stay silent. He looked directly at them, then gently reached for her hand. That small gesture, simple, quiet, said more than any argument could. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with emotion, and for a moment, she felt seen. Not judged, not dismissed, just seen. Her parents, still trying to process who this man really was, began to look closer. The tailored coat, the luxury watch, the calm authority in his voice, it all hinted at something they hadn't expected. Who exactly are you?" her father asked, suddenly hesitant. The man smiled slightly but didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned to his wife and asked softly, "Are you okay?" She nodded, though her voice still hadn't found its way back. That's when the real tension started to build. Her parents weren't just confused, they were starting to feel uncomfortable. Not because he was wealthy, but because they realized they had judged him, and their own daughter, so harshly without knowing the full truth. The man's success was no accident. He had worked in silence, built his businesses brick by brick while staying out of the spotlight. He had never needed approval, especially not from those who looked down on others. And yet, here he was, standing in the middle of a room where the woman he loved had just been humiliated by her own family. What happened next didn't just change how they saw him. It changed how they saw her. But just as he was about to speak again, something unexpected happened that no one in the room could have seen coming. Just as he was about to speak, her younger brother walked in, holding a glass of water and wearing that same smirk he always had around her. "What's going on?" he asked casually, glancing at his sister, and then doing a double take when he saw the man by her side. "And who's this?" he added with a laugh, unaware of the shift in energy that had already taken place. Her husband didn't flinch. He looked around the room, at the mother who had always compared her to others, the father who never once praised her, and now the brother who treated her like a joke. For years, she had lived under their judgment, always trying to prove she was enough. And still, they had never seen her worth. But he had. "Maybe I should introduce myself properly," her husband said at last, his tone still calm but firm. He reached into his coat pocket and handed her father a business card. Her father took it reluctantly, squinting at the name. His eyes widened. You're the CEO of. He stuttered, almost dropping the card. Her mother stepped forward, snatching the card to see for herself. "This can't be real," she whispered. "That company is worth billions." Her brother scoffed. "What, so now we're supposed to believe our sister, Mary asterisk him asterisk? That's just luck, not some kind of achievement." The word stung, but she didn't react this time. She was used to being underestimated. That was the part that hurt the most, not their disbelief in her husband's success, but their lifelong disbelief in asterisk her asterisk. And her husband saw it. All of it. He turned to her brother, about to respond. But then the doorbell rang, and what was waiting on the other side would turn everything upside down again. The doorbell echoed through the house, cutting through the silence like a blade. Everyone paused. Her father exchanged a glance with her mother, uneasy. "Were we expecting someone else?" she asked nervously. No one moved. Finally, her husband walked over and opened the door. Standing there was a sharply dressed man holding a briefcase, flanked by 2 assistants. "Mr. Rivera," he said with a respectful nod. "We weren't sure if we should come inside, but you asked for the documents to be delivered in person." Her husband nodded and stepped aside, letting them in. Her parents watched, completely confused. The man in the suit walked to the living room table and opened the briefcase. Inside were several thick folders, labeled with names they didn't recognize, companies, properties, trusts. "Everything is ready for your signature," the man said, "including the transfer of the new investment property and the foundation papers you requested." Her brother laughed awkwardly. "Wait, what is this? Are we in some kind of movie?" But no one answered him. Her husband sat down calmly and flipped through the pages. She stood behind him, still processing everything. She had no idea this was coming either. The foundation, was that for her? And the investment property? He hadn't said a word about any of this before today. He had walked into this house with full knowledge of what might happen. He had come prepared. Her parents began to realize that the man they dismissed wasn't just successful, he was powerful. And not just with money, but with intention. He had built an empire and had chosen asterisk her asterisk to share it with. Not out of charity, out of love. But just as the papers were being signed, her husband looked up and said something that made her heart stop and left her entire family speechless. Her husband looked up from the documents, eyes calm but voice firm. "Before I sign anything," he said, looking directly at her parents, "there's one thing I need to make clear." The room froze again. "I was willing to let the past go. The way you treated her, the way you've always looked down on her. But what I can't accept is how you continue to treat her, as if she's still beneath you, even now." Her mother stiffened. "We were only being honest," she replied defensively. She always aimed too low. He didn't flinch. "No." She aimed for peace. For love. She gave you her loyalty, her respect, and you gave her shame in return. Then he turned to his wife. "There's something I haven't told you," he said quietly. She blinked, unsure of what was coming next. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out another envelope, this one marked confidential. "I had a private investigator look into something a few months ago," he said. "Not because I didn't trust you, but because something didn't sit right with me." Her eyes widened. Her parents went pale. "The truth about what happened to your college fund, the money that was suddenly gone right before your final year." He continued, "You were told it was a banking error, but it wasn't." He handed her the envelope. "You deserve to know who really took it." Her hands shook as she opened it. Inside were records, signed documents, bank transfers. Her breath caught. She looked up, tears forming, not from sadness, but from shock. Because the name on those documents wasn't just someone she knew. It was someone sitting in that very room. And everything she thought she knew about her family began to unravel in that moment. Her eyes scanned the papers, each line heavier than the last. And then she saw it, her father's name. He had signed off on the transfer. Her own father had quietly drained her college fund years ago, using it to cover a private debt he'd never told her about. She had spent years blaming herself, thinking she had somehow lost the chance at her future. But it wasn't a banking error. It was betrayal. She looked up slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You took it." Her father opened his mouth but couldn't find the words. Her mother stepped in, voice trembling. "We did what we had to. Your brother needed help. We didn't think." "You didn't think *I* mattered," she said, her voice rising for the first time. "You never did." Her husband stood beside her, placing a steady hand on her shoulder. "She sacrificed everything and still stayed loyal to you. And even now, you try to rewrite the past like it never happened." Her father sank into a chair, shame finally creeping into his face. Her brother stayed silent, his smirk long gone. And then, just when it felt like the final truth had been laid bare, her husband turned back to her and said quietly, "There's one more thing." He handed her a second envelope. Inside was a deed. "I bought the house," he said, "the one your parents live in. I closed the deal last week." Her parents gasped. "You what?" "I'm not doing it to take revenge," he said calmly. "I did it so *you* get to decide what happens next. Because for once, your voice should be the one that matters." She looked at the deed, then at the people who had once made her feel small. And in that moment, everything changed. She stood there, holding the deed in her hands, the weight of her past and present finally meeting. For years, she had accepted silence as strength. She had kept her head down, hoping that one day, her family would see her for who she truly was. But that day had never come, until now. Her parents didn't speak. They couldn't. The truth had stripped away all their defenses. Her brother stared at the floor, avoiding her eyes. She looked at her husband, this man who had stood beside her not just today, but every step of the way. He had never needed to prove anything, yet he had done everything to protect her dignity. Not with pride, but with quiet purpose. "I'm not throwing you out," she said softly, looking at her parents. "But from now on, the respect in this house goes both ways. I'm not the same girl you used to talk down to." Her voice was calm, but firm. She wasn't angry. She wasn't bitter. She had simply grown. Her parents nodded slowly, the reality settling in. It wasn't just about wealth. It was about value, something they had failed to give her, but something she had finally found in herself. Later that evening, after the visitors left and the house grew quiet, she and her husband sat together on the porch. The night air was cool, but peaceful. "I never needed revenge," she said, leaning against him. "Just truth, and a chance to be heard." He smiled. "And now you are." She had walked into that house as the woman they once called a disappointment. She walked out as a wife, a leader, and a woman who finally knew her worth. And sometimes that's the quietest kind of power, the kind that doesn't need to shout to be heard.